Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us all today. My name is Yamila Simonovsky, and as part of the knowledge sharing efforts by the Youth Employment Funders Group and USAID Youth Power to Learning and Evaluation Network, it is a pleasure to welcome you today to this event on climate smart solutions for rural youth. It is a topic of great interest, and we appreciate you taking the time from your busy schedules to really come and learn together and reflect on these solutions to advance youth employment for rural youth especially. We will be delving together into how in the face of climate change and the challenges that it poses, we can enable young people to access decent job opportunities and really improve rural livelihoods using climate smart solutions. So we will hear from experiences in different countries, and we hope that you also, again, in the Q&A question or Q&A section, using the Q&A feature of the webinar, can comment on other experiences that you are working on or that you know about. So our speakers will share learnings around efforts and strategies to foster youth employment in rural settings, and really focus on models that seem to be promising for advancing youth employment in the agri-food sector. So as we learn and we reflect together today, and we start and continue the conversation on this topic, we encourage you again to share your questions, to share your experiences on innovative approaches, and also discuss any links to future initiatives. So we have a great lineup of speakers today, and to kick off the event, it is my pleasure to introduce Elisenda Estruch Puertas, who is an economist with more than 15 years of experience in international development, and she has been providing policy support, capacity development, and as well carrying analytical work to promote and advance decent work in the rural economy. So she currently works at, like I said, the ILO in the sectoral policies department. And it is a pleasure to have you here today, Elisenda. Thank you for joining us today with opening remarks. I'll pass it to you.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me and the ILO to contribute to this timely webinar. I am pleased to participate and to give you a little bit of some opening remarks that I hope they will enrich the discussions, and I think we will all learn from each other today. Just let me start that it's timely because it underlines the importance that agriculture does have for the livelihoods of more than 1 billion people worldwide, and including many of the rural poor. And this sector is highly dependent on natural resources and predictable climatic conditions. But at the same time, unsustainable agricultural practices have substantial negative impacts on the environment. So we can see that the agri-food sector does play a significant role in efforts towards a greener economy. And at the ILO, we talk, and I believe many of our partners do so, recognize also the importance of promoting a just transition in the agri-food sector, because it can be an important driver for the sustainable development, but also as an important driver, as we will be seeing, for decent work, social inclusion, and eradicating poverty, particularly for the younger generations. Because millions of young women and men are living in rural areas, have aspirations to make a positive impact on the environment, to foster social justice. However, at the same time, they face many challenges, decent work deficits in particular, that hamper these aspirations. So in an unequal world, increasingly unequal world, young people in rural areas have even greater difficulties to access decent work, to gain independence, and to fulfill a role that we would see them as innovators, job creators, leaders. So as I was saying, as the ILO, we underline the importance of a just transition, greening food systems and rural economies more broadly. And this involves the transformation. It's a deep change in food systems in the way they function now to ensure that they benefit everybody, benefit the society as a whole. So farmers, farming communities, agri-food workers, youth, but also enterprises, consumers, and of course, the environment. And in doing so, we need to harness the great potential that this has for the younger generations. And at the ILO, we estimated that an additional 8.4 million jobs could be created for young people by 2030 through the implementations of green and blue policy measures. And in fact, in last year's International Labour Conference that gathers together governments, workers, employers from all over the world, they adopted a resolution precisely on a just transition, and it acknowledges the importance of advancing towards a greener and more sustainable future. And it acknowledges these profound implications that it does have also on jobs and livelihoods, and therefore puts forward a framework for action that covers these social dimensions of environmental and climate change. So it provides us also guidance on how we can unlock the potential of agri-food systems to create green jobs also for young people. Because we have some challenges ahead. We need to find solutions to absorb a growing labor force. We need to meet a growing demand for food because there is growing population, but at the same time, we cannot keep intensifying food production with, as I was saying, unsustainable food practices. So we see youth as playing a key role in transforming food systems, in ensuring that we have enough healthy and nutritious food, that we harness their dynamism, their talent, creativity, and innovation, because they are really agents to shift agri-food systems to more regenerative patterns. So that would entail, of course, harnessing the potential of agriculture and agri-food change in terms of improving productivity, working conditions, and even remuneration levels. So to make it also more attractive to rural youth, I think there's also a component of attractiveness to the younger generations as well. I think we can draw many, and as ILO, we draw many lessons learned through our ILO-led global initiative on decent jobs for youth. Rural economy, but also green economy are key themes in the global initiative. That it counts with more than 95 partners, and it's an excellent space to make commitments and sharing expertise. We also are part and actively engaged in the Global Donor Platform for Rural Development. It has a technical working group on rural youth employment, and precisely we've been exchanging and trying to coordinate better on aspects related to green jobs for rural youth precisely. And I would like also to take the opportunity to share about the Green Jobs for Youth Pact. It was launched in 2021. It looks really into green jobs, youth, and what action can be taken, not only to equip youth with skills for green jobs, but also to instill them the sense of responsibility and to give them also a place in the spaces to discuss a future for them in many of the sectors, including agri-food. So what I want to highlight is that all these global initiatives complement each other, and they underline the efforts that we are all putting together to address this fragmentation in youth employment interventions within food systems and rural areas. And I think an important point in this regard is the need to work with and for youth. We have a challenge ahead that it's quite large. We need also to acknowledge the heterogeneity among youth. Not all young people in rural areas are the same or have the same aspirations. So all these interventions cannot continue to be developed without their participations, without the participation of youth. So in that regard, I think I want to emphasize the pivotal role that social dialogue has, that a rights-based approach has, to build consensus, to shape interventions through the inclusions of young people. I think that's at the center of ILO's approach, and I think it's important for all of us as partners to commit to translate these youth voices to concrete action that responds to the needs and goals. No, and let me conclude that I think that we need to operate at a large scale with substantial resources, putting youth at the table and discussing. In that regard, we have ILO policy guidelines that provide us with crucial guidance on how to develop policies in that regard. I hope we will have occasion also to discuss about that today. And another key element I wanted to share with you is the importance of building the capacity of national actors, including our social partners, because we will develop these large-scale programs, and I think we need to also enable them to the capacity to implement them, right, at the time and with effectiveness that we need to meet the goals that we have ahead of us. In that regard, at least I can share the experience at the ILO. We work with our training center in Turin, and for example, precisely on the topic on rural youth, we will be organizing a training later on this year, because we think that it will help us to look with participants on what policies can work better, which strategies, with which tools we can work better and help them in make the transformation we need. So let me finalize by saying and underlining that we are on this together. I think working together, we can achieve the scale and the impact that we need to transform agri-food systems towards a greener and more resilient paths of growth. And once again, thanks again for giving me the opportunity to open this event. I hope that I did my homeworks, and I would like to now introduce you our moderator, and that will proceed. So with no more ado, let me introduce to Jane. Jane Lowicki-Zucca serves as Senior Youth Advisor within the USAID's Bureau for Resilience, Environment and Food Security, where she works to strengthen the agency's efforts to engage youth in inclusive and sustainable agricultural-led growth, nutrition, resilience, water security, sanitation, and hygiene activities. And with no more ado, Jane, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Elisenda, thank you so much for that excellent framing. It was really inspirational at the same time that you were clearly outlining challenges. You put out some really hopeful ways forward, including underscoring with young people. So thank you so much. And a warm welcome again to everyone. Thank you all for being here. So it's such a privilege. I'm so pleased that we're together and doing this. I want to say a little bit more about the Youth Employment Funders Group before we introduce the first speakers. So this is a network of funder organizations that collaborate to advance youth employment efforts in a more coordinated and effective manner, and to ultimately improve the capacity of youth to achieve better labor market outcomes and success across their lifetimes. The group seeks to generate and share knowledge on what works in the field of youth employment. And USAID has been one of the founding members of YEFG, together with the ILO and also the IDB lab, and we're a member of its steering committee. And we continue to be delighted and committed to continue to participate in the Youth Employment Funders Group and a range of other groups and initiatives to increase youth empowerment and livelihoods. And Elisenda has already mentioned one of those, which is the Global Donor Platform for Rural Development. Its thematic working group on rural youth employment. Generation Africa is another one, as well as investments and learning, such as through YP2LE, one of our co-organizers today. So I'd love to introduce to you the next two speakers. First is going to be Frank Bertelman, who is the project director of GIZ's Rural Employment with Focus on Youth project. And his work focuses on the interface between sustainable economic development, and rural development in particular. Then we're going to hear from Dr. Christine Allison, who is the team lead for the USAID REF's Youth in Agri-Food Systems Learning Activity under YP2LE, which is the Youth Powered to Learning and Evaluation Activity Mechanism. And she has led an assessment of how young people coped with shocks and stressors in 2 countries, Bangladesh and Kenya. While they speak, please feel free to use that Q&A function during their presentations, and we'll monitor that and come back to those questions when we get to the Q&A. So let's get going. And Frank, I invite you to take the mic, and we can't wait to hear from you. Thank you. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jane, and thanks for having us. It's a pleasure, and also looking very much forward to this webinar and the discussion. So I will share a couple of our experiences on youth employment, but also on the relevance of green jobs in youth employment. And if we could get the slides, that would be helpful. Yeah, perfect. And yeah, maybe just some conceptual considerations on green jobs and the linkages to agri-food systems, and some very concrete project experiences, examples, without going into details. It's more like an overview, a little bit of a menu, but I hope this is a good basis for the further discussion. So just if you can have the next slide. Just starting with our project context, that you understand where we come from. So the focus is really on youth employment in the agri-food sector. And we have an advisory component doing conceptual work and policy advice for our ministry here in Germany. And we implement in the 4 countries you see here, Kenya, Burkina, Malawi, and Mozambique, with a kind of very target group specific approach. And we developed or adapted this so-called integrated approach for employment, bringing together labor demand and labor supply through matching, through ecosystem development, through better policy framework conditions, and try to downscale and bring that together really at a target group level. So the next slide. There you see some of our results and impacts after 4 years across those 4 countries. So 30,000 to 40,000 people who participated in training measures and also benefit with improved employment perspectives. More than 11,000 people who have increased income and found new or additional employment, which is a lot seasonal employment, of course, in agriculture. And yeah, if you are interested in more details, here's the link to our M&E dashboard, which I think is quite a nice feature. And there we have the key outputs and results and impacts available also for everyone. So this is the starting point. And now the question a bit, why do we and how do we address the topic of green jobs? The next slide, please. So thanks to Elisenda, I think you already elaborated a lot on the context, the relevance, why this is important. If you can have the next slide, please. Just a few numbers again. So many people, especially in African countries, still are employed in the agri-food sector. And with the population growth, 25 million people enter the labor market every year. So there's a huge need to provide jobs. And I think often there in rural areas, there are not many opportunities outside. So it's definitely relevant. At the same time, the agri-food system or sector contributes to roughly 1/3 of global emissions and up to 70% of use of fresh water and other impacts on biodiversity. So there's a clear need to make agri-food systems more sustainable, to provide enough food, but also livelihood opportunities for people, but that within planetary boundaries. And I think that's the clear case. So I think it both makes business sense. And I think agri-food systems, climate change, they are highly interrelated, and economic development. So to address those interfaces, I think green jobs in agriculture is a very important concept. Next slide, please. Yeah, just an overview on some of relevant publications, links, and resources. I think, Elisenda, you also mentioned some of them. I also like this World Bank report very much, on specific examples on the green transition for job creation in agri-food system, but also this include publication, which is looking cross-sectoral, but specifically for youth employment, but agriculture is also part of it. And for example, this G7 document is more looking into how to monitor green jobs from a donor perspective. So I think this is just for information. Don't want to go into many details. If we can have the next slide. So exactly the question for us, we're struggling quite a bit is how to define and how to measure green jobs. So what is a job? What makes it green? What are the necessary monitoring requirements, both for your project works, but maybe also if you want to access, for example, carbon credits or compensation payments for that, where you really have to show environmental impacts and effects. So I think that's still a challenge, and maybe some considerations on how we dealt with that. Next slide, please. So there are a couple of definitions, and I think most are relatively similar, but still rather general. No, it's I think decent jobs that preserve or restore the environment in traditional sectors, so manufacturing, construction. So, and here we talk more about greening, but also in other sectors like renewable energy and energy efficiency, which is quite straightforward. Now that this is kind of green jobs, and everyone understands that easily. But for more traditional sectors, I think we have to explain what are the contributions and where are the environmental impacts as well. And this is sometimes not so easy. I think for resource efficiency and less inputs, less water, I think that's still rather easy to measure. But if it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, carbon modeling, and these kind of things, it's quite complex and not so straightforward, especially in smallholder farming systems. We have high transaction costs and many people involved. So one practical solution. Oh, no, sorry, I think there's one more slide on the next, please. I think here the potential, I think Elisenda already mentioned, also the figures behind it to create additional employment in those sustainable practices. And I think the key point here I would like to make is that there's a kind of disconnect between the different agendas. So one side in the UN Food System Summit and others, now we talk about agri-food system transformation. Then at the COP, we talk about climate change and just transition. And I think in the last 2 years, there was a kind of bringing this together, at least starting, but still there is quite a disconnect. And I think this is part of the problem, but maybe also part of the solution, and where green jobs, the concept of green jobs in agriculture can also build a bridge. And now the question is how to go about that, because usually these definitions are a bit blur. I think, please on the next slide. So in many cases, there is quite a good understanding what is sustainable agriculture. It's about organic production, of course. It's about agri-forestry systems, which really benefit the biodiversity, as well as a more diversified production system. So I think this is quite clear. Also drip irrigation and things like that, on resource efficiency. But where to exactly draw the line? I think this is not 100% easy, and a very pragmatic approach from another project, which focuses on green jobs, especially for women, also across different sectors. And here's one definition for the agri-food sector. And here the idea or the rationale behind is that you have to comply with at least 3 of these minimum criteria. And then for the monitoring purposes, you can count that as a green job. Of course, this is not perfect, but I think for many project cases, it's sound enough. And I think you can still of course, fine-tune the level of detail, also depending on what our monitoring requirements are, and also how many different interventions you have. So I think that's quite adjustable, but we think it's a very straightforward solution and enough for many projects. So on the next slide, we now come from the how to monitor, how to promote actually green jobs in the agri-food system. And here, one more slide ahead, please. Here again, you see this integrated approach with labor demand, labor supply. So here it's basically about skills development. Here we talk about job creation, here about job matching and business opportunity matching, and here to make the local ecosystems work and to improve framework conditions. And I think to really bring this together for young people to find the right jobs with the right skills and really benefit from the overall system, and also be involved in decision making and planning and policy discussions. So I think this is what we try to do. And here we have on the different boxes, it's basically about greening the things, and it's not as greenwashing, but really to analyze and to model and to work out what are green business models, what are their ecosystem impacts, what are their financial impacts, and there, but going from the different sides and try to make it work. And then now I will take you through some of the examples now which are related to different pillars of this integrated approach. On the next slide, please. So here's one on rather classic one on compost production from our project, where we really focus on using industrial waste and not only the leftovers from your 2 acres, small scale farming, and to try to bring it to scale and with relatively easy technology, but I think it's a sound business model. It pays good money for now 15 startups employing more or less 10 people each. So I think that's a rather straightforward and good example from Burkina Faso. On the next slide, it's more a bit on the production side on sustainable agri-food systems, combining, for example, honey production, apiculture with different crops, promoting local traditional grains, or also different products in organic farming from different countries. And on the next slide, we have an interesting example looking more at skills development, the so-called green colleges from India, where you have different courses from rather short courses to, I think, 2 years of vocational training and education to become ecopreneurs. So we talk about agripreneurs, but now really with a focus on green business models. So I also like the expression of ecopreneur. Here you've also find more information under links. And the next example is now from Colombia, where it's the project worked with different partners on very pragmatic solutions like milk cooling facilities, certification, etc. But I think what is interesting here, the last point, on a kind of green business incubator, where young people are supported to develop their business idea and to realize them in practice. And then on the next slide, I just have a couple of conclusions and recommendations. One more, please. So we think that green jobs are really a crucial element to connect the different agendas and to benefit both people, but also the environment. And that young people are key actors for innovation. They are change agents for sustainability agendas, but also for the agri-food system. But I think to address their needs, and especially needs of young women, often you need to go the extra mile and have this 360-degree approach to also make it work for them. And I think projects should define what are the opportunities for green jobs, and what are skills requirements, and where are the specific entry points. This is not always easy, especially if you don't have it as your main project objective, but rather as a side note. But still, I think there are a lot of opportunities, and to being climate smart, I think it's also a requirement for every business model to be sustainable in the medium and long run. And a couple of recommendations more at policy level, I think, to better connect the agendas. And I think there was some really good progress now at the last COP with this Emirates Declaration, and that agri-food system played a much more important role. And for example, there was concrete tools like this NDC guidance tools with different policy options, which was presented also at the COP. But there we need to invest more in developing these green business models. And sometimes they are viable, sometimes they are not 100% competitive. And there sometimes we also, or it makes sense, it justifies compensation and incentives not to promote those business models, which also have not only social, but also environmental benefits, and therefore also justify public investments. And we think that especially for young people, to bring this together is a kind of at least triple win or multi-win strategy to really invest in those business models, green jobs in agriculture, and benefit people, planet, and profit at the same time. And that was my last slide, and I pass back to Jane.
Wow, Frank, thank you so much. There was so much in there. Rest assured, everyone, he mentioned links, and we'll make sure those links get out and access to the rich PowerPoint material. So yes, I appreciate the hands going up. And Frank, I love what you said about, integration in the ways that you described it, and that clarity, and spelling that out is such a value for so many of us to see how you're addressing supply and demand, thinking about policy. And I love the language you use on downscaling, and seeing how elements fit together, and really underscoring again those messages about the need for both jobs and sustainability. I love that you shared all of those resources, and we can all rest assured there are really so many things that are emerging, that are out there, that can be tools and sources of information. You really put squarely also the notion of green jobs as an idea for bridging disconnects between maybe a focus on food systems, agri-food systems, and on climate change, and really bringing that together. But then that practical challenge of what does it mean? We're working ourselves at USAID on some adaptation of jobs diagnostics to really bring in a focus on what does it mean to deliver green outcomes, especially in informal circumstances. And also the practical examples, the notion to be youth-centered, and really bringing in that third P of people, planet, and profit. Now, I love the juxtaposition a little bit of what Dr. Allison is about to talk about, because, I'm close to this project. I've been working on it with her, but it is very, it's about the voices of young people and their experiences amid the ongoing stress and related shocks related to climate change. So it's a different way of kind of looking at that notion of the 360 that you're talking about, Frank. So, Christy, I would love to hand it over to you now.
Great.
Welcome to the stage. Thank you.
Ben, if we could have the next slide, please, that would be great. Oops, moving one more beyond that. Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for attending today. We're so glad to have the opportunity to have a discussion with you about how youth in the food systems cope with shocks and stressors. One of the challenges in the expansion and adoption of climate smart approaches and in green approaches in the food system is, what does one do when things sort of spiral out of control, when there's a shock or a stress to the system. And so we had conducted a study. We wanted to share more about that with you today. Looking more broadly, the purpose of the learning activity that Jane referenced is to bridge the gaps in USAID's current understanding of the ways in which positive youth development approaches have been applied to resilience, environment, food security programs and policies, and what their impacts are, including with gender-responsive private sector engagement. We also seek to understand how to effectively engage youth as drivers of change and resilience in agri-food systems, including as it relates to agriculture, food security, nutrition, and water management. Youth also contribute to country self-reliance, and we want to understand that better also. So those are the overarching goals of the activity. Next slide, please, Ben. The findings we're going to share with you today come from a study conducted by Making Sense International and Restless Development with the support of USAID. And that support was not just from Washington, from Jane's office, but also from the missions on the ground in Dhaka and in Nairobi. None of this would have been possible without them, and with our very talented local teams on the ground in both countries as well. And we are very grateful to them for all of their work and their support in making this study and presentation possible. Next slide, please. So we use two different sort of conceptual frameworks to inform this. As we noted, the purpose of the overarching activity is to fill some of those evidence gaps. The purpose of this particular study within that was to fill an evidence gap by identifying sort of what are the differential patterns in how youth and older adults, if we look at youth thinking about ages 18 to 29, and we certainly were interested in youth younger than that too, but we, for ethical reasons, we're working only with youth who had reached age of majority in those countries. So looking at youth who had attained adulthood legally, and then adults who are over the age of 30, and understanding what are the patterns and how they cope with shocks and stressors, where opportunities may exist to improve support, particularly for youth in agri-food systems in response to future shocks. And you can see we've got, sort of two presentations there, or two graphics that represent the different models and conceptual frameworks that we were working with in terms of how USAID conceives of positive youth development, the different factors at work that support that, and then resilience capacity. What's important to note is that climate smart solutions and green approaches typically appear in the adaptive to transformative capacity areas. So absorptive capacity typically does not generate climate smart approaches, or does not allow for the consideration of climate smart approaches. Think of that as where people are sort of doing their best to hang on. The climate smart approaches come into those more advanced stages where people can respond to and take advantage and see new opportunities in some of the crises that are occurring. So, as I noted, one of the issues that's hinted at in much of the literature around the impacts on communities of various shocks and stressors is what are the differences between youth and adults. They have different coping mechanisms at their disposal, and we wanted to use USAID's positive youth development framework and that resilience capacity framework to pull out and really tease out those differences. We know lots of individual characteristics, household characteristics, and contextual factors mediate both the shocks and the responses. And we do know this was a small scale study, but it has given us an opportunity to begin to explore this space. And we hope that this learning agenda will also be taken up by future researchers and considered as we think about what are the data we might collect around different programs as we begin to move forward on this agenda. So Ben, next slide, please. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus just on one of the research questions we asked. We had 4 different research questions starting in, but the one we're looking at today really focuses in on what are those resilience practices and to what extent do youth and adults differ in how they use them. We had 4 primary data collection methods: a literature review, focus groups, interviews, and an online survey. And the respondents, as I noted, were youth aged 18 to 29. We had 6 focus groups in Bangladesh comprised 3 and 3, young men and young women. So 27 young men and 26 young women. We had 4 in Kenya, 18 young men and 22 young women, 2 and 2. So we did have single-sex focus groups on those. And the youth that we spoke with in both countries were primarily working in production, production of vegetables, of fruit, raising livestock, aquaculture, horticulture. However, there were some who were working in inputs, in both services and, for example, the provision of inputs such as fertilizer or processing of agricultural products, and some were also in the retailing end of activities. It's useful to note, as we look at the next slide, we had we had 2 different sites in Kenya, and we had 3 different sites in Bangladesh. Can we switch to the next slide? Sorry, Ben. Thank you. So as we look at these sites, they were chosen for specific reasons. They are all sites where USAID is working on youth programming in those countries, as well as food security and resilience-related programming. They each represent a community that was vulnerable to climate change and had experienced environmental stresses. In the case of Kenya, desertification; in the case of Bangladesh, flooding and rising sea levels. And all of those things were in action prior to 2020, prior to COVID, and in the case of Kenya, the desert locust infestation. And the layering of these different crises and shocks within those communities served as an interesting point of query and sort of understanding how the compounded and impacts really drove their responses, their resources, how they were able to cope with that, and how they're looking at the future. I should note that these are all, in Bangladesh, they were peri-urban youth typically, so they were not from city center, but they were from surrounding areas. As you look at the map, those are the gold dots on the map on the right. In Kenya, they are Isiolo and Marsabit. Those are the red dots in the map on the left. And so that was also peri-urban and rural, much more rural on the Kenya side than on the Bangladesh side. What that tells us, among other things, is that different climate smart approaches would be appropriate, right, in these different locations, given the different challenges, the different kinds of economic base that each community relies on. And so we expected to see a great variety, or hope to see a great variety in what youth would share with us about their approaches. Next slide, please. So let's dive into the findings and hear about what the youth did tell us. Next slide. So a key finding is that youth's outcomes depended in large part on their economic situation prior to the shock or stress occurring. This largely shaped their options and behavior in their coping strategies. Youth adopted a range of coping strategies to manage the impacts of COVID-19 lockdowns and, in Kenya, desert locusts. Common solutions across all communities and all the, both male and female, and looking at that full range of ages that we looked at. There was an increase, of course, in activity. We saw a depletion of savings, both personal and business. Business savings, generally, youth had much less than the older adults in their communities did. We saw increased reliance on borrowing, and that was particularly in Kenya. And it's important to note that VSLAs, Village Savings and Loans Associations, were the preferred mechanism for saving because youth perceived it to be harder to borrow from SACCOs and other microfinance organizations that were active in their communities during the desert locust infestation in particular. Another common response was downsizing their operations and trying to minimize their risk that way. And another key factor that came in was sort of decreased long-term earning capacity. They made conscious decisions to stop going to school, or they weren't able to return to school once their schools reopened in some cases. And the other sort of vector through which we saw sort of the decrease in long-term earning capacity was that depletion of savings for reinvestment. So the vectors through which they might have added value to their businesses over time were both limited and negatively impacted. On the positive side, there were some upsides. There were some uptakes on this. So one was the diversification of livelihood strategies. In many cases, youth did diversify, for example, into retailing. So they would set up their own kiosks or set up their own stand in the market if they hadn't done that before. Many of them did switch crops, and they would change to crops that required less water, that were, required less investment going in, or that had a greater demand in the local market where they didn't have to transport and get into wider distribution networks. That also applied to livestock. You had, in many cases, youth shifting from, for example, cattle to goats or chickens, something that requires a smaller footprint, less water, for example, and reduce their outlay. That also, however, reduced their potential income from those activities. It's also useful to recall that it was a broader context of mostly negative coping strategies. Overall, we saw more negative. These were the ones related to jobs and employment in particular, income earning in particular. But we saw decreases in the meals that families were consuming, that youth were consuming, often from 3 to 1 per day, increases in hunger, malnutrition, as food items such as meats, vegetables, fruits were no longer available or were costly and not affordable within communities. We saw school leaving. In Kenya, there was a little bit less school leaving, but if the youth couldn't pay the school fees, or the parents couldn't pay school fees, the children had to repeat a year. So they could repeat without additional cost, but they weren't getting what one would expect with additional years of learning. There were increases in early sex and pregnancy, particularly in Kenya, increases in isolation in Bangladesh, especially for the girls, emotional and psychological distress in all communities, and that was particularly marked around male gender roles, and the need for men, and young men in particular, to establish themselves as providers. And that was not possible for some of them in this context. There was also an increase in unpaid work, especially for women. Next slide. So teasing out some of those differences, we wanted to understand better, as I said, what were the differences between youth and adults. So we had these shorter coping windows or increased deprivation, where youth have a more limited resource base to fall back on than the older adults do. There were 2 different ways that sort of manifested as we looked at the impacts on youth. One was that it was a shorter coping window, or they had greater deprivation than the older adults. The experiences of severe stress were problematic, especially as youth risk and decision-making faculties aren't fully developed until their mid-20s. And this becomes a critical factor in choosing coping mechanisms, and also looking forward at solutions in terms of how they might position themselves and their futures, thinking about what are those climate smart and green solutions they could adopt. I also noted earlier the dangerous coping mechanisms, the long-term economic ramifications, and then the shifting gender roles. So let's move on and talk for just a moment about some of the solutions that youth identified for themselves. Next slide, then. So one of the key things, there are 5 sort of key categories that youth identified: finance, market development supports, technology, entrepreneurship supports, and education. The market development supports and entrepreneurship supports aligns very closely with the matching approach that Frank had mentioned. The technology approach introduced something that was really interesting for this discussion, which is that the more food insecure, the more deprivations youth had experienced, the less interested they were in experimenting. They were more interested in what they knew were going to be well-tested, tried technologies. And our sample's too small to draw any conclusions from that, but it is useful to think about it as a potential factor in thinking about what is the risk tolerance given the situation, the context that youth are in, what's the decision-making likely to look like, and drawing on that disconnect that Frank had mentioned. So just thinking about those important constraints, what information might be shared, short-term, long-term potential, and helping youth make some of those good decisions. Next slide, please. So finally, what were the final lessons coming out of this? Youth economic resilience. As I mentioned before, outcomes were highly dependent on the level of support they had. What's interesting is that some of those transformative outcomes that we were able to capture, where youth did engage in really strong, good green practices, they probably didn't think everything through. They probably didn't have all the information they might have had. They probably didn't know what a risk it was they were taking, and they were successful. We don't know where they weren't. We do know that that is a challenge, and we want to make sure that we have appropriate supports in place when we're targeting diverse youth for supports for development and emergency response. Another key thing that emerged was sort of the youth participation in community decision making. youth see the social risk of advancing their own agendas or trying to push into space that they don't view to be something that they're able to occupy. However, in one case in Isiolo, the elders in the community ask the youth to be the ones to solve and figure out how to meter the water, how to manage the water plan. And the youth grabbed it, took it on with both hands. And the elders in that community really shifted from a gatekeeper role to an enabling role. And that was quite significant for the youth and for their outlook and their understanding of where they could go and how they can contribute down the road. And it gave them an opportunity to, try some new solutions that have the potential to be climate smart and green as they're looking at water management, which was really exciting from our perspective. So I think we're out of time here, so I want to move that forward. But just the final word on this would say, thinking about what are those limitations to adopting climate smart solutions? What do we know? It's that the youth don't have knowledge sometimes. They lack state of the art, or they lack access to environmentally friendly inputs and modes of distribution, for example. We found that too with the lack of access to fertilizers that they knew to be better, but they weren't able to get those midpoint, and then they had to rely on things that were less environmentally sustainable. So as we think through how shocks and stressors impact what it is that we do and that youth do as we transform the food system, as the youth transform the food system, we would be well advised to make sure that we are being careful and cautious and smart ourselves in the support that we offer. And I look forward to hearing reflections and discussion from others as we talk through how we might do that better. So back to you, Jane.
Thank you so much, Christy, and big applause. There's so much in here and so much richness. I know we're a little behind, so I'm not going to do a big summary of that. I think everybody's really taking it in. There's quite a lot there, and I was interested to see when the thumbs and the hands were going up. I hope in the questions somehow that you can kind of bring forward some of the things that maybe are resonating and relate a question to it. And thanks for all of those additional hands coming up there. So again, this gives a strong focus of the person themselves and the interface with the notions of when sustainability is possible amid shocks and stressors, and how young people cope. Now, we have the opportunity to have a first set of reflections from a young person with us today. And I would love to call to the mic Jack Omondi, who is a co-champion of the YP2LE Business Entrepreneurship and Private Sector Engagement Community of Practice, and has also been working on issues in Kenya. So we're delighted to have you here, Jack. May I ask you to take the mic and offer some reflections to get us started? Thanks.
Thank you, Jane, for that introduction. I'm sorry I'm not going to put my video on because of some technical challenges. But let me start by saying that many speakers have acknowledged that climate change is a global issue that affects the food system in different ways, but also the young people. And mostly it manifests itself through increased flooding, outbreak of pests and diseases. Like in Kenya, at some point we had an outbreak of locusts, but also climate change is linked to COVID-19. And so to increase the resilience of the young people to climate change in agri-food system, but also to respond to your question, Jen, I think young people need to embrace technology. And one thing that I've learned is that agriculture has an image problem, particularly among the young people in the world, including Kenya. And so my opinion is to, the only way to attract the young people to climate smart solutions in agriculture is to make it more appealing to them. And how can we do this? We can do this by integrating technologies that are not only appealing to the young people, but accessible to them, such as use of smartphones. some practical solutions in use of technology, especially ICT, is to use our mobile phones to disseminate information that regards weather, market information, especially the labor market analysis data that is really important to the young people. When I was working at Don Bosco Tech Africa, we really engaged the young people in Don Bosco TVET centers in Africa, including Kenya, in green projects and in embracing green technology like biogas. And biogas, when we used it in our TVET centers, it helped the young people to recycle food waste that was really rampant in the schools, but also it was generating energy that was being used to cook and to at some point to even chill the milk that we had at that moment. But also we used biogas as a source of manure. So that is one area in which technology can be used. But also we engage more in terms of indigenous tree nurseries. Sorry, we used or established tree nurseries in these TVET centers just to provide indigenous fruits and trees. And you know the importance of indigenous fruits and trees, since they can withstand the unpredictable weather patterns. And Frank, or I think it was Frank, who had talked about green colleges. So we also ensured that we came up with centers of excellence for green projects that promoted green skills. And some of the green skills that we promoted at Don Bosco was in waste management, but also in greenhouse technology. And so these are things that the young people really embraced and took care of. Another suggestion that, one thing that I really need to ask from our speakers, but also our panelists, is that we need the green actors or the agri-food system actors to really define what green jobs and decent jobs is. Because at some moment there is a gray area on what green jobs or decent jobs are and where they can be found. So you see, many young people are really enthusiastic about the green jobs, but also the green skills. But where do we get them, and how do we differentiate that this is a green job and a decent job, and this is not a decent job or green job? Another suggestion that I would really put forward for the young people is they should embrace collaboration and networking with experts and peers. A good example that promotes collaboration and networking is the communities of practice rather. Communities of practice are more or less informal networks aimed at facilitating exchanges of knowledge and experience. And YP2LE, which was mentioned by Christy, has different virtual communities of practice focused on different areas. For instance, at the business community, at the business entrepreneurship and private sector engagement community of practice, where I am the youth advisor, we are majorly focused on different areas, including youth involvement in agriculture. And we have held so many webinars focused on agriculture and how young people can maximize their potential and learn from others. So it is important that we join different communities of practice within the YP2LE, but also agri-food system actors need to come up with different physical or virtual communities of practice that the young people can easily exchange ideas, but also learn from their peers, but also from experts within that area. Another important suggestion that the young people can take is to enroll in training programs that promote green skills, green entrepreneurship, and life skills. You see, I also want to draw my experience from when I was working at the Don Bosco Tech Africa, which was promoting TVET and education or TVET offer in Africa. And one of the things that we really promoted is green entrepreneurship. And you see, green entrepreneurship entailed even the learning of soft skills. And we also ensured that after going through the green entrepreneurship program, we made sure that we placed the young people with in different relevant industries in a strategy called job placement. And these are things that young people need to also take keenly and appreciate the role of TVET centers or any other learning institutions that promote green jobs, green skills in agri-food systems. And I think most of them, even our government currently, is promoting green TVET. And this has been promoted in Eldoret, especially those who are familiar with Kenya, but also in Marsabit, where Don Bosco has a TVET center. I think another suggestion for the young people is to join cooperatives, cooperatives and circles, depending on how it is framed in your country. It has been discovered that young farmers do not really get proper value for their products because of somehow middlemen exploit them. And so we need to ensure that young people are engaged in cooperatives. And this is why I want to draw an example that when we had last year around September or October, August, we had a very valuable or worthwhile webinar with Fair Trade Africa, and it was promoted by YPTLE, where we discussed so much about the importance of young people joining cooperatives to maximize their the benefits that come with that. But also, we had a young person from Ghana giving us a proven practice on how cooperatives has helped him to maximize his potential in working with the coffee industry. So these are some of the ideas that I think young people can really take up to improve their participation in the agri-food system. Back to you, Jen.
Jack, thank you so much. Those are all, such a range of opportunities, and thank you for sharing your experiences at Don Bosco in particular. Now, I'd say we have about 10 minutes. We want to make the most of it. And I have some sort of summary questions. We'll keep all the questions and hopefully be able to get answers back to individuals if we can find you in our signups. But I would love to pick up on some of what you're saying, Jack, and open the floor to everybody. Elisenda, Frank, Christy, Jack, and also Sven from GIZ, who's on the call as well. We're talking about the ability to access services and opportunities in different types. And I'm wondering if you would comment a bit more on how we are making progress and making them flexibly more available, including in the area of education. Not everybody, for example, Jack, will have the opportunity to find a vocational education program. They're not always linked to job opportunities if we are not working on the demand side as well. So thinking about some of the incentives that are needed to be able to right fit some solutions in any local context, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, some of the opportunities and barriers around that flexibility to adapting to new ways of doing things and making some more opportunities accessible, including education for girls, among other things. And as you mentioned, different types of learning opportunities. Would anybody like to talk a little bit about that? Flexibility in programming to adapt and making those opportunities available to young people?
Yeah, let me take.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead, Frank.
Yes.
And then Is it Frank and then Jack?
Now it's Sven.
Oh,
Maybe
Sven.
Frank
Hi,
will
Sven.
take some
This is Sven
other.
Bralik.
Yes, and maybe Frank will take some other questions later.
Welcome.
Yeah, the question of flexibility and designing projects and what projects can do. I mean, of course, ideally, measures for climate change, adaptation, green jobs are considered from the very beginning and are an integral part of the initial program design. However, climate change challenges can be addressed even without that specific focus. Yeah? And I think that the examples and experiences from our project presented earlier by Frank are proof for this, since we didn't have any thematic focus, but could identify many entry points. I can only stress again what also just now Jack said, when promoting youth employment, a strong focus should really be on this green entrepreneurship. So it's really worth looking for green, environmentally sustainable, agroecological business models. But there are also many more opportunities, and we saw that on the slide stating all the possible links in all pillars of the integrated approach for employment promotion. So there are many, many entry points. And as we heard in connection with monitoring, being pragmatic always helps and always also provides this kind of flexibility for projects. Over, maybe someone wants to add?
Thank you so much, Sven. Frank, did you just come off mic to add something?
Yeah, maybe just to add some ideas and reflections, but I think Jack already addressed many of those. I think one way is definitely to access resources online, and I think there's lots out there, especially Access Agriculture comes to my mind, where there are a lot of videos on different farming practices, crops, etc. I think there's a wealth of information. Of course, you need internet access, but I think this is really a huge resource of information for practical things, trainings, different skills, and other resources as well. But I think also on the local context, to organize yourself, exchange with other young people, learn from farmers, learn from other institutions, see what's available. We also have this kind of tool to organize rural opportunity fairs with ATVET centers and schools to see what kind of trainings and webinars and offers are available there. I think that's something very pragmatic, which can be done relatively easily. But of course, there are also limits, and if there are no formal courses or service offers from schools, education centers, and there's no donor program around, it's not so easy to access them in many locations. But I think the online is definitely a good way. And the other one, I think, is just to also ask for it, demand it, to look for it, to reach out and to learn from each other. And I think here, youth organizations and youth networks can be a powerful tool.
I would second that as well. I think the lessons we've learned from this and other projects are that those peer-to-peer relationships are incredibly powerful, especially in the absence of other resources. And so where we're able to support those youth networks and support sort of that more informal dissemination of information, that can be a really productive and useful way forward.
Yes, and this is really bringing out themes of those coping strategies and the negatives mixed with the positives and having to find new ways forward. And I think we did hear that strong theme on technology, as you mentioned, Frank, with Jack. And I guess that leads to questions of, which, when, how to incentivize, right? And that flexibility you're talking about, Sven, and being prepared to pivot. That's one of my favorite phrases, which is plan for success, but prepare to pivot. Elicinda, were you about to come off mic there too?
Yes, I want just to complement what has been said, because I agree with all the suggestions that the colleagues have put forward. I I found them very interesting. On the technology, I think what Frank and Sven have mentioned, and also Christine has shared, it's important, but it's always important to keep in mind this inclusivity, no? So by expanding the access, because we believe that technology is opening doors, we should not create new barriers or deepen other divides that already existed. So we think in that sense that it's important to, well, we are advancing a dual transition in that sense, so a green and a digital transition, and we do believe that it needs to be inclusive. So the social dimensions need to be very clear and prominent in both of them. And the other thing that I wanted to share is, or at least what I think is important is this webinar is also highlighting the importance of acting at different levels as well. So we need to act at the local community level, enterprise level when we are speaking about wage employment as well, but also local, sectoral, national, and global. I think that challenges are ahead are such a number, and that actors are so different that we cannot continue advancing in silos. We need to talk to each other, but at those different levels. I think there are spaces of dialogue. We just need to be maybe more systematic. That's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Many thanks for those excellent reflections as well, and underscoring the social justice aspects of it and inclusion as well. Now, we are actually about 3 minutes from our originally scheduled close, and we do want to stay on time. So I am wondering if I could ask each of you for 30 seconds of a final message that you would like to leave with folks. I'm sure you've seen some of the questions coming in as well, if there's anyone that you want to pick up that you might want to speak to directly. But what would be a final message that resonates from some of the interests that we've seen popping up and across the different interventions that we've heard today? I think that I would like to perhaps start with Frank, then Sven, then Elisenda, then Christy, and then Jack. So over to you, Frank, for one key takeaway.
Okay. Yeah, I think one key takeaway, both from our experiences, but also from what Alison presented, I think to start with the needs and capacities of youth, because otherwise many service offers, projects do not cater to the specific situation and context. So that's really important. And I strongly believe that there are a lot of opportunities in the agri-food sector, but also looking at sustainable practices, because that's the way to go. It often makes business sense. For example, with rising input prices after the war in Ukraine, I think organic inputs are much more competitive. And there needs to be certain or improved framework conditions for the business models which are maybe not yet competitive, but are in general, including also environmental costs. And I think there's a huge opportunity and definitely the way to go.
Many thanks.
Just
over to you, Sven. 30 seconds.
Let me just add very briefly. Frank mentioned the needs of youth. And I think from our project experience now, we can also say that there is a huge interest and willingness of youth in these sustainable green business models. They may not be perfect yet, but this is something that really gives hope also. Over.
Love it, hope. Elisenda.
Yes, I second that. So from my side, I think a key takeaway for me is, as we were saying, to work for and with youth. So putting them at the table, process of, as I was saying, social dialogue to ensure that the responses, as the colleagues were saying, are tailored to their needs and aspirations. And the need for integrated approaches. I think that what Christine was showing is that the shocks are shaking them in ways that deepen already challenges that they were having. So are laying bare pre-existing challenges and deepening further. So we need to act through integrated approaches. So the labor demand and the labor supply side probably are a response to that. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Over to you, Christy.
Thanks. I would build on what Elisenda said and note that to achieve some of these goals, we need to help position youth differently in their communities and within the value chains that they work in, so that they are seen as innovators and leaders. And there's a need to create that space, and it's often through informal mechanisms rather than through formal mechanisms. So there is some need for intergenerational work as well as we go forward through this to make sure that we are creating an environment where youth can thrive.
So true. Youth are not out there alone. They are connected, and those intergenerational approaches and links are critical. And Jack, over to you for really a last word.
Yeah, so
30 seconds.
Yes, 30 seconds. What I've learned is that there are so many resources that are targeted to the young people. I've seen a lot being shared from the GIZ, the YPA2LE, but also the ILO. So young people, we need to access these resources, but also use them for our own benefit, but for the benefit of the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. And thanks to all, thanks to the audience, thanks to the organizers and those involved in the studies in Bangladesh and Kenya, for example, as well. There is such rich sharing today, so many resources and connections to take advantage of. We invite more interaction across these learning networks, and we look forward to sharing all of these details with you, the links and the PowerPoints, and we look forward to the next time. Thank you for being together with us today.